Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am Lindsey Lupo at Point Loma Nazarene University, so just down the hill over there. Got a beautiful view here. Thank you for being here today. In the words of Jay-Z, you could be anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here the day after Pride, the day of the World Cup final, and on a beautiful day in San Diego. So I really appreciate you taking time to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm here to talk today about democracy, democratization. It's a lot of what I study. I actually am just back from the Czech Republic. I teach a course in Prague on the transition to democracy, so I co-teach it with a Czech professor. I took a group of Point Loma Nazarene University students. I had 12 students there. We spent about a month, this is the third time I've done it, we spent about a month talking about that particular transition to democracy in the Czech Republic in 1989. It's a really great way for the students to sort of get a glimpse at their own country, whether that's Mexico or the US. We have students from both countries, and really allows us to sort of expand our perspective. As I'll get to today, in recent years in teaching that class, it's become a little bit more the decline of democracy rather than just transition to democracy. So we are in what we call a reverse wave of democratization after that initial wave of the 1980s and 90s. So this particular trip to the Czech Republic was, I would say, particularly interesting in that sense of having those hard conversations. So let's get in. Which one am I going to shoot?
Test it. No, here. Please stand by.
Is it?
An audio video professional will be with you in just a moment.
I got here early to practice, and we forgot the most important part.
We'll switch to your next slide for you right now.
Okay, yeah. Actually, you can fly in the first one. Okay, so I find that with any conversation about democracy, democratization, with my students or just in life, I want to first be sure that we define democracy. We can look at democracy as just like, are they holding elections? But it's important to make sure that we go beyond just those procedural elements. We want to also look at the substance of life in that country. What is it like for individuals living there? So, democracy has high levels of public contestation and participation. By public contestation, we are talking about political competition and opposition. So it is the question of, are elections truly free and fair? And importantly, are there true alternatives in the voting booth? Is it truly the case that you can walk into that voting booth and that you can select the person, the party, the policy that you want? And do you, to some extent, really have a sense of like, we don't know how this is going to turn out, right? It's not just sort of handed down like this is how it's always going to be. So that's public contestation. Participation means that each person has the broadest range of rights possible in terms of participation. They can protest, they can vote, they can show up at a local government meeting. And it means that there's true inclusivity, that those rights are expanded as broadly as possible. So that's kind of a working definition of democracy. You can fly in the next one. This is from a book by Brennan called Democracy, A Guided Tour. We can say that democracy is a form of government where the people have real opportunities to participate in the government decision-making process and they are considered equals. So suffrage is universal, everyone, one person, one vote. Rights are extended to as many people as possible, and the people are the true decision makers. In political science, we often refer to that as control of the agenda. We might have representatives that we have elected to office to make those decisions ultimately, but we are the ones that are controlling what is on the agenda, what is being voted on in terms of policy. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is just what is the decline? What is happening? So we've established what democracy is. Now let's talk about how is it in decline, like what exactly is happening here. Go forward. All right, so the first one, 68% of the world's countries meet the minimum requirements for democracy. So we mean that 68% of the world's countries are considered either fully free or partly free. The Freedom House organization is this prominent organization that classifies countries according to their level of democracy, and in a really helpful kind of stoplight way, they have 3 categories: free, partly free, not free. So 68% of the world's countries fall into those categories of partly free or free. The way that they're measuring democracy is they're looking at 2 different indicators: political rights and civil liberties. Political rights are things like, are there free and fair elections? Are there competitive political parties? Do opposition parties exist in the country, and do they actually have a voice? Like, do they actually play a role? And minority groups have an extensive level of rights. That's political rights in a nutshell. Civil liberties are things like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the media, freedom of religion, academic freedom. It's also things like having a truly free, independent judiciary and very, very low levels, hopefully 0 levels of discrimination against minorities. It also often looks at whether or not there is a free economy. So this number, the 68%, doesn't exactly represent like the best of the best, because a lot of those partly free countries are not super great for things like discrimination, corruption, freedom of the press. But if we want to say like just kind of meeting those basic benchmarks, 68% is where we're at. If we took out the partly free countries, that number would decrease to 41%. So it's only 41% of the world's countries, so way less than half, that are considered fully free. But if we look 50 years ago, the number was only 56%. So it can feel really hard to be in this moment in time when it feels like, and it's truly happening, that democracy is in decline. But in aggregate, we're doing better than we were 50 years ago. For those of you who are like maybe my age and older, this is going to be for obvious reasons, right? We had this moment in time between the 1970s and the early 1990s where we had a massive wave of democratization. So the fall of the communist countries, this is most obvious with the Soviet Union and all of those communist satellite countries, but it's also Southern Europe, so it's Portugal, it's Spain, it's Greece, it's also Latin America, it's Argentina, it's Brazil, it's Uruguay. So massive, massive movement, more and more countries moving into that category of democracy in that period of time. There were some golden years. We call 1988 to 2005 those golden years, and that's because like everyone kind of thinks of 1989 as this pivotal moment with like the fall of the Berlin Wall, again the Soviet Union collapsing a few years after that. 1989 is also the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which eventually became the Czech Republic. During that period of time, 88 to 2005, the number of countries that ranked as not free dropped by 14 percentage points, and the number of countries that were ranked as fully free increased by 10 percentage points. So again, this is a wonderful period of time when there was all this hope of like, this is where we're heading. There's a famous academic, a historian, who wrote about the end of history and said like, we've arrived, right? Everyone is like on board with this. Like, you know, the Soviet Union, they figured it out. Russia, you came along, you've joined us in this world of democracy. It is the end of history, we've gotten there. I think we can all think about how that turned out in terms of Russia, and you see why 2005 is sort of that break-off point. So the next one tells us a little bit about what is happening now. I was teaching my first version of this class, Transitions to Democracy, in 2005, and I remember the day that the Freedom House report came out, and they had flipped Russia. Russia, believe it or not, was briefly a fully free country according to Freedom House, and in 2005 it flipped to partly free. And that was the first moment I thought, something seems off here, not just because of Russia, there were other countries that were showing these signs. So we've seen some backsliding since then. Every time I've taught this course since that moment in time, that number, 68%, has gone down more and more. So just 3 years ago when I taught the class on democracy, it was 72% of the world's democracies that were meeting that minimum requirement. So it's going down. It's still not as low as it was before the 1970s, but it's going down. So if you go to the next one and fly in that one. So this is directly from the Freedom House annual report. We have measured a decline for 20 consecutive years in a row. So for 20 years, we have seen it just clip down a little by a little by a little. Again, this is measured according to political rights and civil liberties. Those are the two indicators that they use, and those two indicators have like 10 sub-indicators that they're looking at. So we've registered these declines for 20 years. If you go to the next one, this is just last year what happened in 2025. We have a total of 54 countries that experienced some kind of deterioration, so some slippage in their level of democracy, but we did have 35 countries that registered some improvements. So again, it can get easy to get caught up in some of those numbers that are going down, but we do have some instances where we're seeing some improvement in countries around the world. I'm going to go up to the next one. So this, I like the visual way to look at this. I just realized, I was like trying to turn back this way. I realized I could just look at it right here in front of me. So the Economist Intelligence Unit is tied to The Economist magazine, for those who are fans of that periodical. But the Economist Intelligence Unit essentially measures democratic health. It looks at a number of key indicators like electoral processes. It looks at pluralism, functioning of government, participation. It looks at political culture, so looking at like democratic attitudes. How much do people want democracy? How much are they willing to engage in some level of tolerance for groups that they perhaps don't sort of associate with? That's how we measure political culture, and also civil liberties. So you can see that graph and the way that it's taken this dip, particularly around like 2018, 2019. And again, we see like a little bit of a clip back up in recent years, but nothing that would sort of regain what was lost over the last few years. So the next thing I want to talk about is, where is this decline happening? Fly that one in. So again, just looking at a snapshot, what's happening in 2025 in particular, I wouldn't put like too much stock in this because like 2024 was really different, 2023 was really different. So we'll look at some trends, but if we just want to know like last year what exactly happened, these are some of the countries that had the largest declines. And again, we have some countries that recorded some large increases. So there's some positive news there with a country like Syria. That's a country that was obviously very, very low in level of democracy, or just like zero functioning government. So we've seen some improvement there, Sri Lanka as well. The countries that have the largest declines, you can probably look at those countries and sort of guess what's happening. Burkina Faso is one of those that has experienced a very high number of coups in recent years. In 2022, they had 2 coups. The country is now almost half of the territory controlled by jihadist groups. If it's not controlled by a jihadist group, it's controlled by a very, very authoritarian government. So there's a lot that's happening in a country like that. That's why in 2025, it tanked so much in its level of democracy. We've also seen some shifts, so you can fly in the next one, in terms of what has been happening in consolidated democracy. So for a while, we thought that the countries that were experiencing declines in democracy were the countries that had recently transitioned, right? It was countries like Russia. It was countries like Hungary. We're starting to see that the most consolidated democracies, so a lot of the countries in Europe, like Germany, like France, but also here in the United States, those are some of the countries where we're also starting to see that chipping away at rights. So that's been something that surprised us. So the United States has had a 12-point decline out of a 100-point scale. In recent years, Hungary has declined drastically, 28 points. A lot of that, almost entirely, that has to do with Viktor Orban being in office. In 2014, he gave a very famous speech where he declared that he was instituting what he called illiberal democracy, meaning that he very proudly was sort of removing personal agency from society, like no more of this choice that leads to too much wildness, too much sex, too much drugs. So he was touting a lot of that Christian nationalism rhetoric that we ended up seeing come from him over the next few years after that decade after he gave that speech. We'll see what happens with the new leader in Hungary, but Hungary took such a hit that it's going to take a lot to get it back up. India, with the rise of Hindu nationalism, has seen a decrease of 14 points. South Africa, rising corruption, a decrease by 7 points. Those are the ones, the consolidated democracies that have taken the biggest hit, but the European Union has also on average seen a decline of 4 points over the last few years. Okay, the next slide, I always think it's interesting to look at where the least free countries are. Sometimes in our world we can feel like things are getting really bad, like if democracy is starting to decline. For perspective, perhaps it's useful to look at the countries where it is very, very bad in terms of levels of freedom. So in terms of the Freedom House organization ranking these countries according to their level of freedom, these are the countries that are the least free. With my students, I always like to include the picture of Kim Jong-un in North Korea because I think it just represents so much of what we see in the most restrictive countries, which is cult of personality, which is a lot of sameness, right, lining up in that very orderly fashion, wearing the same thing. He has mandated that men in the country have to have the same haircut. He measures it according to inches because he thinks that long hair for men can lead to depleting brain cells. I don't think he cares about women because apparently he doesn't care how long the women's hair is. He's outlawed all kinds of like K-pop influence. So people can go to jail in terms of like if they have like bootleg copies of like BTS or something. And I say this to my students because one, it's like what they can relate to with like K-pop, but also like it's funny until you're like, that's just so disturbing in terms of that loss of personhood and the dehumanization that occurs in these countries. So again, you can also look at these countries and say like there's a lot of conflict in these countries, genocidal tendencies. This is where life can get really rough. I was just, as I said, in Prague with my students. Radio Free Europe is based in Prague, and we had the opportunity to tour the facility where they broadcast either television or radio to the 18 most repressive countries in the world. And a lot of these countries were on, are a part of where they're broadcasting. They are able to get video out to actually a lot of these countries, except Afghanistan. And we got to go into the sound booth where they were literally using a shortwave radio to try to jam through to get information to anyone in Afghanistan that they could get that information to. I asked if they had female reporters that were giving the news, and they said yes, which I thought was funny, just to take that Taliban in terms of how they're getting their news, right? So it was a really powerful way to see like how these countries are just so blocked off, right? So restricted. To look at the most free countries, I don't think you can really see that exactly. We've got, just take a look and start to think of like, what do these have in common, right? So we've got Norway, New Zealand, Sweden, Iceland, Switzerland, Finland, Denmark, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg. Most of them are Northern European countries, so these are what we would, most of them are Nordic, honestly. These are what we would often refer to as social democracies. They have a few things going for them. They're very, 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 very small. So there's a lot of ways in which just doing democracy and policy making at a very local level is just more possible, which increases the chances of higher levels of democracy. So they're heavily decentralized. They decentralize a lot of power to the local districts. They're also very, very pluralistic in terms of their political atmosphere. These are multi-party systems. They have what we would call cross-cutting cleavages, where it's really difficult to sort of like pin people into like one particular category. People tend to join groups, whether that's like civic organizations or just political parties, that you can't sort of predict, like if you are a part of this group, you're probably a part of all these other groups. It's a little bit more fluid in that sense. They also have very, very strong infrastructure services, right? So these are countries that pay a lot in taxes. These are what we would call welfare states, in the sense that the government is providing sort of the social safety net. So they pay more in taxes, but they're getting more, right, in terms of like clean, efficient public transit, housing, education, healthcare. All of those things that I just mentioned increase levels of trust. So we know from the surveys that trust in these countries is very, very high. Trust in government, I should say. High levels of trust in government, which is correlated with higher levels of democracy. If the government is working for you, if you feel like it's working for you, if you feel like there's protection and you have, again, agency in that process, then you're going to have higher levels of trust. Some of the downsides that I feel like we shouldn't ignore, these are very homogenous countries, right? Again, they're very small. And I think we want to be really careful there to not correlate these things and make the argument to be a stronger democracy, you need to be very homogenous. That's not at all what I'm saying, and not at all what I think democracy scholars would advocate. But it is something we're thinking about, of like, how do we adopt what these countries are doing in more diverse, large countries, right? How do we sort of bring some of that over? In terms of this, I love looking at the maps. I'm gonna realize I set a timer and then I'm like still going over. I'm gonna get to the end. If you want to see a little bit of just what this looks like regionally, one of the first things you'll probably know, I should point out, dark, dark red, least democratic. Dark, dark blue, most democratic. You'll see the impacts of colonization here. So sub-Saharan Africa, right, you will see a lot of red in the region. That is a legacy of colonization and the inability to develop their own systems and even draw their borders in the way that works for them. You also can notice on here some large impacts, so big countries with a high population. So just looking at Russia and China, right there, those two countries being red, that's 1.5 billion people that are living in a non-democratic state. And India, also over 1 billion people, is increasingly growing less blue and becoming more red. So if that tips over, that's one that we're going to be pretty concerned about. In terms of why the decline is happening, the first reason is armed, and I'll get to President Bukele here, armed conflict and coups. We know that, decreased security is terrible for society in a lot of ways, but it decreases your ability to move around, obviously decreases your ability to engage in just basic functioning of government, like voting, so that has really had an impact on democracy. A second reason is that we are seeing intensified repression in those authoritarian states. So countries that are using their security forces, their courts, and their military against their own people. That's one thing that we're seeing increasingly in these authoritarian systems, that they're using their defense systems that are meant for sort of international reasons against their own people. So President Bukele, who has sort of warmly embraced the title of the world's coolest dictator, it's something that he likes to call himself and sees it as a compliment. He has engaged in a lot of repression against academics, so he's prosecuted professors, student activists, heavily engaged in repression of the media, so that journalists are often engaging in self-censorship because they don't want a lawsuit, they don't want the online harassment, they don't want their equipment being taken from them. So all of that has meant greater levels of repression in a country like El Salvador. And then the final one that we can pull up is the attacks on democratic institutions in democracy. So again, in those consolidated democracies, we're also seeing the use of the government against their own people when those people don't agree with what that government is doing. And some of the ways that we're seeing that the most are like shifting legislative districts, so what we in the US would call gerrymandering. What we don't see as much anymore, you can go actually to that next one. What we don't see as much anymore in the countries that are increasing levels of repression is like old school ballot box stuffing, or like watching you and who you vote for, or like buying your vote. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in the world today, but increasingly, and particularly in the consolidated democracies, they've figured out how to tilt the stage in actually a pretty legal way. Right, so it's gerrymandering, it's legislative manipulation of the districts to make sure that a particular party is guaranteed power in that particular district. It's increasing the number of judges on courts, so if you increase, it's packing the courts essentially, increasing the number of judges that are allowed into like a particular district, and then making sure that you appoint loyalist judges. You can see how those two things, legislative manipulation of districts and packing the courts, they end up impacting policy. So it's, again, hard to say, like, it's not, you know, a gun to your head, like this is what we're forcing you to do and that's what repression looks like. It's, we just make sure that we manipulate the system so that then we can pass policies and we can adjudicate on those policies in a way that is favorable to one particular party or one particular perspective. It's also buying up the media. This was the darling path of Viktor Orban in Hungary. He had various holding companies with his allies that bought up virtually every media outlet in the country. Again, this is really hard to detect. Like, it's not sort of something that everyday people are paying attention to. And then they end up just engaging in a lot of propaganda so that nothing is sort of balanced in terms of what is reported out about the government, right? It's only a sort of positive perspective. One more slide. So just a quick glimpse at the United States. Again, this is the Freedom House assessment of what the US, so I've talked a little bit about countries more comparatively, but the United States has seen, again, a huge dip. It struck me this year that we are actually tied with South Africa for our level of democracy, which I think South Africa in a lot of ways has done some beautiful things post-apartheid. I do not think they're a great democracy though, so the fact that the United States is equal with South Africa and our level says a lot about how it's come down in terms of levels of freedom. In terms of what we can do, I'll be honest, this is when I get stuck. I'll just say, like, my own faith tradition is just to engage in lament. And so I feel like I've engaged in a lot of grief and lament in the last few years to say this is not the country that I grew up in. There's a lot that I think is very much at risk here with levels of democracy. My own path forward has been to continue teaching and to have conversations with students about those very subtle ways that democracy is being chipped away. I also have a lot of conversations with friends and family because, again, when it's not the really obvious ballot box stuffing kind of repression, I think it behooves us to point out those really subtle and gradual ways that democracy is being eaten away and it can feel like death by 1,000 cuts. Those aren't fun conversations to have at cocktail parties, but I think they're important conversations to have. I've also tried to make sure that I'm paying attention to who I'm voting for, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of what they have to say about democracy. How much are they talking about the risks that we have of this democracy no longer existing? And so I try to make sure that I am giving my time, my money to those candidates that are propping up democracy. And to me, that's also me assessing, like, how much are they willing to engage with people who view things differently than they do, right? So how much are they willing to talk to people that don't agree with them, as abhorrent as those ideas must be? Like, how much are they essentially saying that they're okay to have those conversations? I will say, and I'll just finish by saying that my students give me a lot of hope. There are some indicators that Gen Z is showing more authoritarian tendencies. That's a whole other talk. But my students in Prague, they were making all these connections. They were seeing it all. And I have a lot of hope when I work with this 18 to 22-year-old age group. And I'm optimistic, and I have kids in that age group. I'm optimistic that things will turn around. We've had 3 waves of democratization in recent history. Every one of those has been followed by a reverse wave of democratization. but it's a pendulum, right? So I guess I also take solace in like the lack of permanence and knowing that history moves like this pendulum. But again, I don't want to put a cherry on top and say it's great, because it's not. This is a hard moment to be living in, but there are some sort of glimmers of hope. So my apologies, I went farther than you guys. Sorry, get me talking about democracy.
Are you passionate about that or something?
No.
Thank you.